Thank you. All right. Welcome to On the Crecy Dead. I'm Etienne de Montague. All of y'all know me, but someone may see this eventually who doesn't. This is an interesting poem that I found in a rather remarkable book called The Battle of Crecy, a Case Book by Michael Livingston and Kelly DeVries. Both of them are noted medieval historians. Livingston's at the Citadel, DeVries is at Loyola University. They've both published a lot on medieval topics. The cool thing about this book, and I kind of want to put a plug in for it, and why I think why it's great for a certain subset of us who like to do our history with getting our hands dirty, is that the book consists of close to 200 primary source documents that were written within a century of the Battle of Crecy. And the way they're presented is parallel text. On one side, you have the original language. On the other side, you have the English translation. There are minimal footnotes. There is minimal analysis. There are some chapters in the back that analyze some of the texts in there, but it's really, and they're in chronological order. So it's really neat if you want to basically have a single source of everything written down about Crecy in the century following it, as it was done, and you read enough of it, you start finding common themes. You start saying, hey, well, only the Italian bankers are talking about this particular aspect of the battle. Hey, this guy, he seems to have heard of this totally differently. So it's an interesting thing. But one of the early pieces in it is a poem called On the Crecy Dead. And I'm going to talk about, I'm going to try and put it into a little bit of context before we go into the poem. So for those who don't know, the Battle of Crecy, part of the 100 Years' War, was fought on August 26, 1346. And an exhausted and outnumbered English army under the command of Edward III faced what should have been elimination in the field. They faced a French army that was decidedly larger than them, near Crecy in northern France. Instead, the English triumphed in a victory that basically shifted the balance of power in Western Europe for the next century.
Yeah, I apologize for jumping in here. I hope you don't mind. I just like to emphasize that point a little heavier, because it's not just the numbers and it's not just the balance of power. They broke the myth. They broke the worldview of the French nobility.
And that's important to this poem, I want to note, because let me get to that. Yeah, you're not wrong. It broke the myth. It broke the French on a level that it's hard to note, that because we come out of an Anglophile history or an English-speaking historical tradition, so we tend to read the English side of the battle. Simple truth is, losers don't write about history. When going through this book, so much of the French pieces are almost mundane. Most of them, things like a bill sent to the French crown for horses lost in the battle, which I thought was interesting because apparently the crown needed to pay its knights for the horses they lost, which was kind of interesting. But anyway, yes, it was a devastating victory. And something that the analysis in this book does actually is cast doubt on many of the elements that are generally accepted. A lot of what we know about Crecy was basically created by the English in the 18th and 19th centuries, because when young English gentlemen started going on the grand tour of the continent, they would go to France and want to see where Crecy was. The local French had no clue, not really. It was something that had happened, and it was bad, and they didn't want to remember it. So we have a lot of English analysis and English propaganda building into it. But anyway, regardless of the doubts in the scholarship, what can't be disputed is the sheer scope of the victory and the vast number of French casualties, including the deaths of many notable figures. So this poem It appears in Recueil des Chroniques de Flandre, a collection of the Chronicles of Flanders. According to a Latin head note preceding it in the original chronicle, it was composed by a member of the house of Sir Jean de Hainaut, Lord of Beaumont in Flanders. It appears to be an early response to the events of Crecy, almost certainly written before the end of 1346, when the shock and horror of the battle was still fresh. The reason we assume that is there are references to things that we know from other chronicles happened in the immediate aftermath of the battle, like within days. There's no mention whatsoever of the English advance to Calais, which is where the English went after Crecy. So if we use those two things as kind of a marker, there's a good chance this was written very shortly after the battle, possibly as close as 3 days after the battle, and possibly on the battlefield itself, in the aftermath. The head note terms the work a copia rotuli, which means a copy of a roll, possibly indicating it was intended to serve as a mortuary roll, a notification of death that could be carried between monasteries and other places of worship, where the name or names of the deceased could be incorporated into intercessory prayer. In the case of nobility, these rolls could also take on particularly intricate and lengthy verse forms. If this poem is a roll of the dead, then it's a very early source. It would represent one of our earliest French responses to the slaughter. Such a scenario is attested by the poet himself, we'll see, because he writes about being in a hurry to compose an accounting of the dead, and he claims also to have firsthand seen the English tent which housed the many coats of arms of the dead. I mean, this is known from several sources that after the English won, they erected a big pavilion and they moved the French dead and their stuff into it. The poem is composed largely as an allegory that attempts to explain the totality of the defeat, what Malvin was talking about, how this basically broke the French myth. It's coming to terms with that, and it does it in an allegorical way. It gives us a list of the dead, including a number of lesser nobles who appear in no other sources. This is literally the only place history marks them, as well as sharp details of events on the field, like the death of King John of Bohemia and the struggles of the Prince of Wales. Little fun fact, the Prince of Wales, the traditional narrative that we get out of our English education is the young Prince of Wales fought at the Battle of Crecy and won his spurs there and was a hero. Prince of Wales darn near got captured. His banner was taken. He was essentially enclosed by the French because he went out and advanced too far. He was captured, and what saved him was that the French got into a squabble over who had the rights to him. And when they started fighting over that, his relief came and saved him. But Edward had that left out of all of the official English narratives because it made his son look bad. The writer of this poem is identified in it simply as a court musician. He identifies himself in the poem as a man named Colin, C-O-L-I-N-S, and that he was a man well experienced in the composition of memorial verses. Unfortunately, that is literally all we know of the man. 14th century record keeping. So let's talk a little bit about the figures that are going to appear in the poem. Most notably, I want to talk about first off, the French and their allies. Because this does focus a great deal on the French dead, particularly the high nobles. And it's important to realize that one of the things that really shook people up about the Battle of Crecy, and it's one of those things, again, that we being so far removed from it just kind of shrug and go, okay, interesting, is that the King of Bohemia died in that battle, John of Bohemia. He was the son of one Holy Roman Emperor and the father of the next one. He was noted for his chivalry and valor, particularly in places other than Bohemia. He was one of those people who you read his career and you go, that's a knight. That's what they meant. He was the definition of knighthood. By the time of Crecy, he had also been fully blind for a decade. and he was still going into battle. He was still fighting. He would be basically have his horse chained to the horses of his household knights who would lead him into battle. So he was considered an absolute paragon of chivalric virtue and a king. You know, kings have far more importance in the time. These other notables, Charles IV, also called Wenceslas. This was the eldest son of John of Bohemia, so the blind king's son. He was Holy Roman Emperor-elect. He already knew he was next in line. He got wounded at Crecy and managed to get out. The other fellows on this list, not so lucky. Charles II, the Count of Alençon. This would be the brother of King Louis VI of France. So the king's brother, killed at Crecy. Charles, Count of Blois, the nephew of Louis VI and the king. So the king, nephew of the king in Alençon, killed at Crecy. Jean IV, the Count of Harcourt, the governor of Rouen in Normandy, and the brother of Geoffrey de Harcourt, who fought on the English side, killed at Crecy. Rudolph the Valiant, Duke of Lorraine, so a duke. So we get 4 counts, now a duke. The Duke of Lorraine, brother-in-law of Charles de Blois, killed at Crecy. Louis de Sancerre, who is mentioned in here, he's kind of interesting because we don't know a lot about him other than he was noteworthy, and his son was super, super noteworthy. His son, who was raised by the Duke of Normandy after Louis was killed, ended up rising to both the rank of Constable and Marshal of France. So again, these are notable people, notable offspring. And finally, Simon, Count of Salm, an imperial count. So he would have been part of John of Bohemia's retinue, killed at Crecy. Prince of Wales, he's the only Englishman mentioned in the poem. Obviously, he's the heir to the throne. He's not referred to as the Black Prince here. That's not an epithet that was applied to him during his life at all. And like I said, this is one of the few accounts we have of him struggling in the battle, something the English narrative ignores completely. The other figures that are important to note in this poem are allegorical. They are the embodiments of chivalric virtues. And most of them are fairly self-explanatory. I do want to just kind of run through them quickly so you know who they are, and I will talk about who's speaking when we get into that. But Fame, who is portrayed here as a page, and it's the only male virtue, which I think is interesting. The other virtues are prowess, self-explanatory, largesse, loyalty, courtesy, joy, vigor, which is mentioned but not portrayed, honor, who is the queen of the virtues, and nature. And nature is the one that I kind of struggled with in this. When I was reading over it, I was like, okay, I get what's going on here. I get what's going on here. I don't get nature at all. And I took for me the unusual step of actually emailing one of the editors of the book. I emailed Dr. Livingston at the Citadel and said, would you mind if an enthusiastic amateur asked you a question about the Crecy Dead poem? And I said, I don't get nature. I get what's going on. I get this basic idea, but it's not making a lot of sense to me. And he very kindly responded and gave me a decent answer of what nature means in this context, which is the original outcome state of God's creative power. Basically, the idyllic way things ought to be if other forces don't mess it up. It really cuts the line close to a notion of predestination that I don't think medieval Catholics were comfortable with. So they couched it in these allegorical terms, but it's basically how things would be if other forces didn't intervene. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to play Read Along with Etienne here. And I will stop occasionally to describe things. And there we go. Can y'all see this okay?
Yes.
I can't see what you see. So, all right. So on the Crecy Dead by Colin de Beaumont. So, all right. When the summer is in decline, we've got to remember this is happening in late August. So at this time, mini ice age, we're dealing with, it's already starting to get cool out. And the sun abandons its lofty course, and the weather gets cold, and the chill withers the foliage, and renders the green trees yellow. And one sees come to death all the fruit that issued from the blossom. And one sees winter approach, following nature's proper course. During that time, by casual chance, I was lying asleep in my bed, and I was there but for the briefest while before I was swept up into a dream. Now hark! I dreamt that I entered a ruined castle. At the door, I discovered a most sorrowful and devastated page. I went to him and plainly said, "Fame, I recognize you well, for I have seen you before, and you have seen me, if it please you to say it. Now tell me, Fame, good Lord, if you please, who's in there?" This man turned his face to the right and went off without saying a word. Indeed, I believe he was unable to speak, for he was so destroyed with grief that his face was bathed with tears, and pale as I clearly perceived. At that point I was most astonished as to the origins of his grief. At that point I could no longer restrain myself from going forth to inquire about this. I entered the hall, I wandered quite far up and down, but I could find no one to speak with, nor anyone to ask about this. I went up and came back down the hall, which was massive, whereupon I discovered a hallway, which was not very wide. At the end of this hall I noticed light and heard much noise. I went straight in that direction, for I greatly longed to know the truth behind this matter. I saw a closed room. I betook myself there with great speed, for I heard much hubbub in there. The original French, Northern French, was murmure instead of hubbub, but I like the way they translated that. I could not go inside. I smelled a strong scent of incense, softly fragrant and full of sweet balm. So these are funerary smells. These are smells that were associated with the dead. Inside, I heard a lady, lamenting, weeping, and despairing greatly, which constrained me to suffer profoundly, for I was not able to enter inside. He's powerless to go in. But I remained there on the other side for a long time, and I did so because I am fully sure and certain that neither Lamech, Rachel, nor Judith, when their life was depriving of Joshua, their excellent king, ever made such an outcry of weeping, of lamentation. So these are Old Testament references. Anybody raised Christian during this time would know these references. Nor since the destruction of great Troy has there been such mourning. So classical reference. Again, he's writing to members of a chivalric culture who are educated in at least the notions of the Trojan War, at least the notions of mythology and the classics. Nor will such despair ever be seen by eyes, nor ever heard by ears, nor has such despair ever been heard before as took place all around the room, such that no man might have had the ability nor the faculty to recount it. Nevertheless, I do not wish to keep quiet about it, but rather I aim to apply myself zealously to what I relate and tell. However little I may be able to understand of it, for God's sake, please do not reproach me if I tell it as I comprehend it, for I am hardly able to say it better. So basically there, Collins is saying, this is an unimaginable tragedy. This is beyond my ability to report, so please just take me at my word. I'm doing the best I can. Shared grief filled the room. Among them, there was one lady who said in a dejected voice, "Ah, prowess, may death lay you low." So this is nature, and she's taking prowess to task. "May death take you low for robbing me of my creation. Ah, Lord, am I not nature who has made, following my desire, the good king whom you have unmade, who was Bohemia's ruler? Alas, I do not know to whom to complain about you, cruel prowess, who by your reckless enterprise and following his desire have led the king to his death, and thus a large part of all glory must come to an end. For this, I call on Lady Largesse, who I see there to stand security." She's basically saying, bear witness, back me up here, Largesse. "Nor will loyalty, as I believe, scarcely argue the contrary, Noble courtesy and poor joy will testify to this. Poor soldiers, how will they manage with a prowess that has hidden and wandered off? Largesse answered in tears. Nature, I do not know what to say. I have so much grief and pain in my heart that I can bear it no longer, and surely it is warranted, for the magnanimous king has died, who gave freely without taking back, who led such a noble life that all glory was captured in him. She's noting the traits of largesse. Oh Lord, he got so well used to his familiar servant since he has lost his sight, which you snatched from him. Do you know that? So basically, largesse is saying, hey, nature, you're the one who blinded him. Courtesy certainly saw him beautiful, joyful, smiling, honoring good company, so holding great jousts and feasts, as a courteous knight should do. Whoever saw such things carried out and achieved by a man unable to see, attracting to himself good people always and leading them with him everywhere, he accomplished this through generous living, through eloquence, through conviviality. I can testify to these deeds. Prowess over there knows that he went off to Prussia with a large retinue to glorify Christianity. So this is talking about good things he did for Prowess. It's also talking about the Crusades against the pagans, and it was a pretty terrible time, but it glorified Christianity. And I know from a great number of witnesses that he said to his knights, my lords, I will be harnessed. If he cannot see, others guide him forward. Surely I can tolerate the pain of the traces, and so the cart goes smoothly. So this is referring to him being chained to his retinue and going into battle. So my lords, do not fear in the slightest to follow me, even if I cannot see. I will properly follow the ones in front of me. And in such way, I will bear the strong, well-placed traces so that you who draw close to the cart, he's using himself as an allegory, as a cart being pulled, follow me with true and loyal hearts. Thus we will be able, with no discredit to ourselves, to ride forth straight to glory. These are the words of that good Lord, the emperor's noble son, honorably attached and led. Ah, surely all good listeners must indeed welcome word, and with that loathe the hour in which you, nature, blinded him. So again, largesse is saying, hey, nature, you played a part in this. Indeed, you condemned that blind man. You will never blind a man so great, and I thereby lost a champion so beautiful that he has no equal. Unable to see anything, he played dice games to keep his people happy. That's a trait of joy. And he went on to hand out gold and silver to everyone around him without holding anything back. Again, prowess praising him. Nothing worse could have happened to me than to lose him, because I do not find, nor do I see, another man who would similarly fulfill my wishes by his generosity. And therefore I tell you to your face, nature, do not forget to tell everyone to join wretched largesse in her mourning. That one who once was lofty is now laid low. And as you can see, I do not see loyalty anymore, nor hear the song or voice of either joy or courtesy. Ever since the man who was praised, glorified, and honored by all, who was a king, son of the emperor, passed away, it is meet and right that we all mourn together. And certainly you should be doing the same, and prowess too should not hold back from mourning. It seems to me, let us all then weep together over Emperor Henry's son. You weaken the eyes of his head, but not those of his heart. I love that line. Nature responded. So nature's going to snap back now. In no way do I want to proclaim your mourning. In other words, she's saying, if you wish to mourn, don't look to me, ask fame to do it. Make fame your messenger. I am preoccupied enough with my own grief. Behold prowess, my opponent, who loved him. And alas, I loved him so much that I clouded his eyes so he would abandon his arms. In other words, nature is justifying blinding the king, saying, I was trying to make him stop fighting. And last through later years. But prowess and also vigor, this is the only time vigor is mentioned, this is the only time her name gets dragged into this, did not thusly suffer the idea, and so they steered his body in such a way that he ended up dying because of them, and thus they led him plenty. Prowess, why was it never enough for you? You had led him into so many places that you knew his valor well. You had properly tested it. You had found him loyal and perfect in all feats of arms, wherever they were taking place. For a long time, that is certain. You know he suffered much pain, always in your service. In Lombardy, in Austria, one hears good talk of these deeds. In short, he was so perfect at wars, at tournaments, at jousts, and in the same manner at all the virtues which perforce incline to lofty honor, and he who wishes to learn his true name should call him the new Alexander. So again, we're praising him with classical references. Why did you, and there's a break in the record, such a man? Tell me, prowess, to your knowledge, you led him entirely without hindering him into Prussia against the unbelievers. Now he is dead, having been entirely unable to see. Because of you, loyalty knows it well. Ah, loyalty, come forth. Am I telling the truth? Yes, lady, without a doubt. So loyalty is almost entirely consumed with grief here. So she doesn't expound on his traits because maybe his loyalty was self-evident. I therefore intend fully to lament him more than anyone else. I see fame there before you. Ask him if he is acquainted with that man's life. I am not able to tell you anything more about it, for my heart is so filled with the sorrows, and he surely deserves to be mourned by me, for I know well that all his life he served me with a loyal heart. Fame can certainly tell you that. At that point, Fame came forth and at that point, Fame, who had crossed into the room, leaving me outside, came forth and responded, "Indeed, Nature, it was so. I know it well, for I saw him crying to his people, 'Charge! Lead me into the thickest fray, or otherwise drop my reins and chase my horse forward. God, keep me from turning back. I wish to die here. I can do no better than in the presence of my true Lord, and I can testify to his end being such. Prowess made him do it all.'" All right, now Prowess speaks up. Prowess, who could not keep silent, told Nature, heaving a sigh, "You have only your creature to mourn. Had he lived through the battle, and this have you not considered? Would it have been honorable or shameful? In other words, if he'd lived, would he have the glory he has of dying in battle? But I instructed him differently. Now, Fame, tell me if you would, when I saw his lords in the fray, and the standard of Alençon get trampled to the ground, then the ranks of Flanders, of Blois, of Harcourt, of Lorraine and Sancerre, and of the good Count of Salm break in the plain. Shields and helmets cast upon the ground, lords perishing. Fame, tell me, should I not have been guiding him and no one else?" So she's basically saying there was too much to do in the battle. Yes, he went forth to glorify prowess, but all these other men were doing it too. I was trying to handle everything. Indeed, no, ladies, but I am weeping from mourning and for good reason. For the good Count of Alençon, who is dead, which is a great loss. Cruel, damaging, and difficult. Alas, now the great army is deprived of its wages. The good man who provided them has died. Now his riches are squandered, which were neither of gold nor silver. They were made up of brave men and of good knights. I speak no more of it. If they have been trounced, in the original French, esbahi, which actually is closer to like shocked or startled, which I think talks to this moment of sheer horror at the scope. If they have been trounced, it is certainly for good and proper reason. As for the noble Count of Blois, about this man I could say so much. I saw him fighting on foot. Loyalty saw it. She was there. And indeed, prowess, so were you. This is Fame still talking. How did you dare start an enterprise? You made him descend from his horse with a meager retinue of men. There was his sword bathed in blood. There I saw him bleeding and wounded, going on, fighting on foot, always ahead until turning back, until he had brought the standard of the Prince of Wales to the ground and held it in his arms as he died. Lord, what valor. This basically is the French saying they captured the Prince of Wales's standard. It was captured by the Count of Blois, who died with it in his hands when the prince was rescued. Me. He was young of age. He was no more than age 36 when he died at Crecy. Loyal, noble, courteous, and honest, his death is a great loss. The same is true of his duke, the brother-in-law, who was the Lord of Lorraine. And surely one must also consider the good Count of Flanders, who died, which is a pity. Also the man of Sancerre, who is the kind of man, though you already knew this nature, for you had guided him beyond this region both near and far, I produce you as witness thereof, for he has always served you well, who merited glory and praise, and certainly at the bitter end, he did not deign to do otherwise than as his own battle cry instructed him. He did not deign to do otherwise than to attack. That was his battle cry. Thus he maintained it for as long as he lived, and he never broke it. Therefore, no one should weary of praising him at high court. And thus always, sorry, and thus also the Count of Harcourt, who passed away, which is a loss, who is as noble, was so noble and so courteous, loyal, noble, and of such high status that he could not have been a better man, and who died there without assistance in the same way you led the Count of Salm to die in the thick fray, whom I saw commanding his people so well that no one could imagine it being better. May the Lord pardon him all his misdeeds, for he died there at your instigation. Ah, Lord, so many fine men died there who I observe remembered here, that never in the realm of France has such a loss occurred as I see here. This is true. This was the greatest loss of life France had suffered in centuries. And I think the parts before that Fame we're talking about are useful because I think they have to be based on the accounts of eyewitnesses who saw these men go down. You know, it doesn't have the fancy. It's too horrific. It's too practical and to the fact. Fame said Prowess, I do hear you. Now have you spoken your fill? Are you done? Indeed, I have been listening at length to Lady Nature and Courtesy and Loyal and Happy Largesse, who are all complaining about me together. But surely it seems to me that this grief should stay with me, and that I should be mourning the dead and lamenting. There is good and ample reason for it, for they were my charges and they died in my service. Let anyone say that I should be at fault, and so that this quarrel may be concluded, let us go before the Queen, lofty honor, who is our sovereign lady. If she judges that I might be to blame, I will not seek to speak about this further. I see her sitting over there. Let's go. At this point, they all arose and came before Honor, who was seated on a throne, and she gave them much joyful welcome when she saw them arrive all together. Nature could not hold back and renewed her unrestrained mourning. Weeping, she calls on the Queen. She protests and complains against Prowess. You'll notice the change of tense. It's just moved to present tense from past. This is the only two lines that this happens in the poem. It is, I've had someone check the French and the tense does change, so the thought is that this is perhaps done for emphasis. So, weeping, she calls on the Queen. She protests and complains against Prowess, and each one as much as she could, reiterating her complaint concerning the others. The Queen said, is this how you exercise your grief for him? From now on, let there be no wailing nor weeping. It must be abandoned, hard though it is. I am your sovereign lady. You are obliged to obey me. Now I wish to pronounce my verdict. I am greatly afflicted by this death. But you may know that I am greatly joyful that they died in such a manner. Now it is meet and right that we esteem their life which has thus ended, and by their end their life has been refined, as much as fine gold is. There can be no end more noble than to die for one's true lord. Here is French chivalry in a paragraph, in just a few lines. Yes, they died in battle, but they died in their Lord's service in battle. It was glorious. This is the best death they could ask for. So I am happy. I have that much more joy for such a death than for 100 men who have remained alive. And for the love of God, if you love them and ever loved them while they were alive, be joyful of this death. For I wish for this kind of death and esteem it. Then she took Fame by the hand and said, go, Fame, do not tarry. I command you and so charge you to go around the mount, to speak praise of those who died in the battle with such honor. Fain, you should thus not tarry to proclaim this immediately, and so you will tell without hesitation that I have within my records, so this is referring to the rolls of the dead that the heralds were keeping, their names and their deeds and their words. Then Fame spoke to Lady Honor. I will go readily, but by my soul, my speech will soon be forgotten there. However, lady, if you wish, it would be good that this affair be set in rhyme and not prose, for in rhyme it is perceived to be more truthful and stamped longer in the memory. This is, to me, an interesting cultural note. Mid-14th century France, if something was set in verse, in rhyme, as a poem, it was considered more authoritative, longer lived, and carried more weight than a simple chronicle. So that's an interesting cultural change of culture there. He goes on to say, and there is a court musician here who serves highborn men in exactly this. Colin is his name, born of I know, and he has many a time exerted great effort to commemorate the good of good men. This is all we know about Colin de Beaumont. That's it. So if he, our narrator, is the poem, this is it. We know he was from I know, and we know that he had written funerary verses before. Fame, go then and find out from him whether he might wish to give this a try. Yes, in truth, lady, I am certain he would, for surely indeed he must. Then Fame came to the door, opened it, brought me inside, and relayed to me in a few words his message upon installing me in the room. He said, look around, good friend. Then I saw the ladies of whom I have spoken, saddened, pale, mournful and afflicted, with lamentation and with suffering. And I saw cast in the middle of the floor many a ragged standard and many a defouled coat, and many a shield so shattered and so scratched that no color, no hue appeared upon them. Everything just badly, horribly broken. This certainly seems to be an account of the tent containing the French coats of arms, which to my mind means Colin saw it firsthand. And all of this greatly saddened my heart. I clearly recognized the 8 standards of a duke, of a king, a duke, and 6 counts, in memory of whom this account has been produced. So these are the aforementioned dead. And I saw anew a whole mount of others. So there's this other huge pile of the dead and their things. I saw the standard of the fine man of Chamont, namely Jean of Amboise, whose death I find unbearably painful. He was a knight associated with the House of Beaumont, so Colin very possibly knew him personally. This may be why he's the first minor, individual named in the poem. That of Muratit, who I mourn. I saw that of Thibaut of Marveil, and of Maulrevière. I heard it attested before Fame that he never fell back on his word, and that he led in his retinue 10 knights, but only one had escaped alive. Beside the standards were scattered, I saw the shields of Guillart of Thouars, of Chemy and of Saint-Dizier, and others of many knights, all split and shattered. Lord, my heart was so afflicted over it being impossible to recognize them, for no distinguishing features appeared upon them. I turned toward the standards. I saw the arms of the good Archbishop Jean of Parthenay, of Guillaume of Chalon, and I also saw quite close to theirs the one of good Jacquemart of Etré, all shattered and broken. I saw the surcoat of Hugh of Alcan, who is indeed closely bound to honor. I saw three more of younger men, quite close still to the standards of Bassart, of Chamillart, and of Saint-Mauré, for whom nature mourned greatly. She considered it a terrible loss that she had lost them so young. No idea who these guys are, but they could have been teenagers, Ah, Lord, I was so anguished that I was seeing so many insignia there, and none I could recognize, whether it was a little pennant or a standard, a shield, a surcoat, or a pommel ornament. All were dismantled and all were broken. This just hits me so hard, because to me, it gives me the picture of the heralds and their helpers literally going through the piles of stuff left behind by the dead, looking for any way to identify someone. So literally a pommel ornament. You know, can we make out the arms on this shield, the surcoat? In this way, I gazed around and I noticed Guillaume Guénant beside his son altogether. So father and son dead. Charles beside Guillaume Turpin, and Guy of Laval, brother to Herpin. I also found Beaumont and Champenois. But it was with great difficulty I could even establish whether or not these were really them. And I turned back toward Fame and said, Fame, by the grace of God, kindly have full knowledge of these coats of arms. Friend, he said, by what means would you like presently to gain this knowledge? You may surely well know that I cannot stay here that long. There's so many, we can't even get to it. So you're going to have to, you know, I can point you to people who can help you. Rather, it is high time that I start preparing to carry out honor's command. But tell me now, I ask of you, did you see as you looked from the mount to the valley, the royal standard bearer who carried the royal banner, who was named Renaud de Saint-Marc, and further Guillaume Guénard, who bore the standard of Thouars, Abalas and that of Cruy, and Robert and Jean of Picquigny? Those were prisoners killed there because over each occurred such a discord as to who would have the two, that I not note that lest it be forgotten that thus was each killed. So these were men who were taken prisoner and then killed in the arguments over who would have their ransom effectively. Again, it's just noting the absolute horrors of the battles. About the other, I will say nothing more in a few words about the others, but to my mind, if you wish to know the truth of it, your best source of knowledge is Guillaume of Surgères. That man will be a good guide for you between him and Huet Cholet. I do not wish to speak about this for much longer. You will learn through them. Simon Chamillard was taken prisoner and Jean of Cailloux-sur-Mer as well. But do you know for sure without any doubt that these two were taken together in valor? They are unable to speak truthfully about this. So these are heralds who were captured and ransomed. So they've been ransomed back, and we don't know whether they actually saw the battle. So maybe you don't want to talk, these may not be your reliable sources, but this Guillaume and Huet, they can tell you what happened. Unlike how Guillaume and Huet can, because here is what happened. Each was captured in battle, and thus at each point they were led away without seeing who was dead or alive fighting, except those who were still in the fighting. Guillaume, however, was discovered among the dead, wounded in the face and body the night after the battle. So he was left for dead and found still alive. And then indeed, Huet Cholet, without a doubt, was found on the third day of the battle, which was certainly directly confirmed. So again, this places it sometime between the third day after the battle and Edward's departure for Calais. And can you imagine being left for dead and being found amongst the dead bodies after 3 days? Pretty awful. Let honor have them, I insist, ranged with the dead in her records, for they had been left for dead, which I think is interesting. Even though they're still alive, count them among the dead. They did their time. And therefore, let them both swear there that it is better for either of them to speak into a sack, which is an idiom, basically like shouting into the wind, than those who have been ransomed in that place. Whereas the two who took part in it all, let them be given full permission to speak. Either will tell it to you truthfully. With that, Fame drew the door of the chamber and went out. And then it came to pass in such a way that I saw nothing, and thus I lost everything I had just seen before. The room, the ladies, the accoutrement. As a result, such a great astonishment came over me that it forced me to wake up. Nevertheless, I remembered very clearly what I had seen in the dream, which I do not hold to have been a lie, but surely a vision. At that very moment, I made the necessary arrangements to render these matters in rhyme. I have to do this with great speed, since I could not learn all their names, and neither could I wait that long until I could speak with either Guillaume or Huet in order to know with certainty all the names in detail. Okay, I'm doing this fast because I can't even speak to the survivors. I've got to get this done. Thus I offer a more general account as my sense bears witness. And so I pray to everyone to pardon me for the lackings of my paltry faculties, which are everywhere apparent. In this little work that concludes here, may the Lord guide us to our ultimate bliss. So that's the poem. What do we think? I'm curious about your impressions.
I think that's just a great, not only historical account. I mean, certainly it gives you more detail than we have a lot of other sources, but it's also a great tool for reconstructing their worldview.
Yeah.
Look, okay, it's way too much. I can't even sum up. Let me just hit the highest of the high points. These guys matter.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many other dead that we can't even count them. But these are the guys that matter. These kings and counts and dukes. And what are they famous for? Well, you know, what are the virtues they find to be important? Honor is the queen, et cetera, et cetera. They're all listed there. What are they famous for? They went into battle with their retinue.
Mm-hmm.
Their retinue is repeated multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
That's how battle is done. You and your retinue go onto the battlefield and you run around until you find somebody who has a smaller retinue than yours and you capture them.
Yep.
And if you're king, no one's going to capture you because you've got a bigger retinue.
Mm-hmm.
So what's this English thing of fighting in companies,
Mm-hmm.
fighting in large units who are not personally loyal to the feudal lord at the top of it, but just like take wages and fight together like they're trying to win the battle or something.
Mm-hmm. I love the reference to Alençon's fortune not being in silver and gold, but in men. You know, it's what he brought to the army.
And I think if you look at it, you have to pick through some patriotism and some reconstructionism on the English side,
Mm-hmm.
but the English were there, hired in companies, paid to serve the king, and they were going to win the battle so they could live,
Mm-hmm.
but also to win the king his due right as rightful king of France.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't there so much for winning personal honor, so much for gaining fame, for being renowned as for their prowess. Yes, certainly Edward and some of the other of the nobles. You know, Edward's out there getting captured because he's playing the same game the French are, and he doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have the troops to do it with.
Yeah,
but he does have the troops to win the war.
Right. And it's interesting to note, of course, that in the analysis portion of this book, and I recommend it if you're interested in medieval warfare, it's great because the primary source documents are so interesting and telling. And it caused me to essentially reassess what we know about Crecy in big ways, to the point where Dr. Livingston and De Vries have a paper in the back where they basically say Crecy didn't happen where they say it happened. And here's why. It happened a couple of kilometers that way, because that fits the chronicles written closer to the time, which is it's an interesting break. There is some debate about it, but again, the narrative is interesting. One of the things that we lose track about with Crecy is that the English were horribly outnumbered, but they picked their ground. They were the first on the battlefield. The French were approaching them. And when you were the defensive force, you did everything to make the battlefield optimal for what you had.
But again, that's Vegetius. That's a Roman approach to battle.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say anywhere in the romance of Alexander or the stories of Lancelot anything about picking your ground before the battle.
Right.
You know, again, we've brought two armies to a field, but they're both playing different games.
Exactly. And in fact, there's evidence in the Italian chronicles, which are important because the Italians were bankrolling Edward III, and they had vested interest in this. The Italian chronicles mention the English using a tactic which is more associated with like the Hungarians and a little bit later called the Wagenburg or the Wagenburg, the wagon fort, where basically they took their baggage carts and made a wall out of them with a narrow opening. And according to the Italians, the English had their guns, and we know they had guns at Crecy. They were basically small cannon or large caliber handguns, had the gunners under the wagons shooting to disrupt the French cavalry, mostly to scare the horses. We know gunpowder weapons were used at Crecy. It's been debatable about how they were used. The Italians say they were basically used to disrupt and frighten the horses, which I think is very likely. So basically the Wagenburg had a single opening in it that was flanked by the archers, and then you had the line of English knights on foot behind it. So they created this choke point that the French had to pass through. And there's all the references of going on foot. Well, that's because the ground was chewed up and everything else. So the French had to approach on foot whether they wanted to or not. And Edward, the Prince of Wales, got captured because he actually got out in advance and decided he wanted to go fill the gap. And that's when he got in trouble and got caught. And thankfully for England, I guess, the French started squabbling over who had the rights to him, which then allowed the relief to get up and save him and kill the Count of Blois. So interesting stuff. Malcolm, I suspect we're going to be talking about this at events for quite some time.
Could well be. Yeah, I need to get a copy of this. I think it would be interesting to look at this and, again, do some text analysis, make some lists.
Mm-hmm.
What are the virtues that are valued in this French chivalric worldview?
Mm-hmm.
What is important? How is battle conducted from this worldview?
Mm-hmm.
Again, really, to me, it's like they came to a gunfight with all their knives.
Yep. Because knives had served them well forever.
They had this myth going back at this point, 200-300 years,
mm-hmm.
of the battlefield supremacy of the armored knight.
Mm-hmm.
And it was mostly true, except when it wasn't. Like
yep.
so many valid theories.
Mm-hmm.
It was mostly true and strongly held that the wealthier knight had better armor and a bigger retinue. So the wealthy knight will always win.
Mm-hmm.
The Duke and the Count are even more so. This idea, so that this outnumbered English army basically fighting like peasants. Remember, keep in mind,
mm-hmm.
the French notion of peasantry
right.
and the English is fundamentally different.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Norman aristocracy in England is a very thin veneer
yep.
over a
Definitely.
culture that believes that the peasantry and the nobility are close kin. They are related. They
right.
speak the same language.
Mm-hmm.
In France, ever since the Frankish conquest of Celtic, post-Roman Gaul,
mm-hmm.
there's a much bigger divide. The peasantry is literally a different ethnicity from the nobility, and they are much more oppressed, shall we say.
Yeah, exactly.
So you never see French nobles arming French peasantry with weapons and arraying them in an army on a hilltop.
Nope.
That'd be a really good way to get French nobles killed. The English can do this because if you give the English yeomanry longbows and say, hey, we're going to France, you can make a lot of money, they'll fight for you.
Yes, indeed. I think the other thing about it, and I think that the thing that still strikes me about this every time I read it, and I read it multiple times a year now, is the way it captures both the glory and horror of warfare. And it bounces back and forth between that. It's praising these men for their deeds of valor and how glorious they are and how there can be no more noble death. And then it describes the heralds of the, in the pavilion trying to find anything to identify somebody.
Right.
And it's, you know,
I think you're right. At the same time, it is both reaffirming the values and virtues of the cult of chivalry, and also saying, and they did this, and they all died.
Yeah, it reminds me of honestly, it reminds me of reading articles and news stories after the September 11th attacks, where they talk about these bits of individual heroism and who these people were who died, and then talk about the horrible, painful efforts that the coroner's offices were going through to just try and identify someone from the tiniest body part, you know, or the tiniest DNA sample. And this was the French 9/11. I mean, it really was.
Yeah, okay.
And the thing is that, you know, France would go on to two fairly monumental defeats in the 100 Years' War at Poitiers and Agincourt. Both of those were important in their own ways, but neither of those had the same impact. You know, in Poitiers, the King of France was captured and held for ransom, and that certainly disrupted the political landscape in many bad ways. Agincourt was definitely a devastating loss to the French, but in terms of political impact, not as much as Shakespeare would have you believe. You know, Henry V, Henry wins at Agincourt and then goes to Paris and marries the princess. No, Henry won at Agincourt, then hightailed it back to Normandy, hung out there for a while, and 2 or 3 years later married Catherine. You know, Shakespeare fast forwards a lot of stuff to tell a good yarn, but we can't rely on him for our history. Perrin, you're muted. If you,
yeah, no, you're fine. The one thing I was wondering about is when you're talking about the way that they mention it both in positive and negative terms, it seems like we have at the same time you have people at least close to contemporary like Descharny that are kind of like having the problem with so much of the chivalry that that are starting to become more courtiers than soldiers. So it's interesting to see that there's also that sense of needing to make sure that these upstart youngins know that there is a balance. It's not just about glory, that there's actually death and carnage.
Yeah,
part and parcel to it.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember when I've got it here. When did Descharny write his book of chivalry? 1352.
Right.
So, yeah, that would have been 6 years later. Descharny writes his book of chivalry.
Yeah. There's
under pressure from the French king, who's still trying to figure out how to make an army that will win against English.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, exactly. And Descharny is this hard-ass, practical General Patton sort of dude. Who it's like. Actually, there's a bit in Descharny that I think would be an interesting counterpoint to this, where he basically says the same sort of thing that Patton did, where it's your job to make the other guy die in battle.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so you have this sense of these people that are, you have these soft. You hear him refer to all these soft nobles, and their courtly dresses and whatnot, and how they need to. Basically tough enough. They need to learn how to sleep on the ground and, in campaign and things like that. And it seems like that's what this poem is some of the softer sides of explaining that part, or when they're talking about the
deputy. Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I really hadn't looked at it in that instance, and how funny that I had my copy of Descharny right here. That was coincidence. All right, we are at the 11:32 mark. Bia, go ahead and switch off the recording. I think we're basically done.